Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the virtual book launch of David Baldacci's new thriller, Daylight, which stars Atlee Pine and a second protagonist. I'll let David tell you about that because we're going to up the suspense, I think, by keeping you waiting. So, David, every time I talk to him, there's new totals here. So, I'm not sure I counted accurately, but roughly 42 novels now and approximately 8 series plus various other standalones and books for children. 45 languages in 80 countries, an international bestseller for sure. How long have you been doing this?
I think it's about 24 years now, since 1996. So,
You are remarkably prolific.
yeah, I think I enjoy it. I never treated it as a job. I've always kept that, 7-year-old childlike wonder when I sit down and I think, you know what, I make a living by making stuff up. And I don't have a boss and I make my own hours. How lucky am I? And I tell aspiring writers all the time, look, it's hard. You have to be professional. You have to be disciplined and diligent. But for God's sakes, please have fun while you're doing it. If you don't have fun while you're doing it, that's going to come through in the pages and it's going to be a drudge. And your prose is not going to be as good. Your plots are not going to be as good. Your characters are not going to be as scintillating. And you probably won't have a long career. You got to have some fun while you're doing this.
How I love hearing you say how you love to make stuff up because David actually, and in a former life, I were both in the law in Virginia, up in the coal fields in Grundy, Virginia, where making stuff up, I promise you, in the law was really frowned upon. So you're a lifelong Virginian, and in talking to your fellow graduate from UVA Law School, Linda Fairstein, she reminded me that you were the two that became novelists.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's something. There are a lot. When I go back to my own law practice, I usually would go back pre-COVID to sign books for partners and clients and associates and people like that, and get back in touch with some of the people I practice law with. I always have lawyers come in and they say the very first thing they say to me is, "Congratulations on escaping." you know, we really wish we could have broken out too, but we couldn't.
I'm trying to think of the name of the author, a lawyer that lived in California. I'm trying to think. Anyway, somewhere on the peninsula, and Liza, I think her name was. Anyway, she had a sign over her desk that said "Publish or Practice," which I thought was a lovely variation on perish. But yeah, it was a wonderful escape, and I sometimes think back to those days in Virginia and I think, okay, here I am a bookseller and here you are with 42 books in. And who would have ever guessed that? Too funny. Anyway, you are a lifelong Virginian, David, but one of the things I wanted to mention, since you have all these different series, is how often you change the landscape that you write about. I'm particularly fond of Atlee Pine in the sense because she's here in the Southwest. She is stationed up at Shattered Rock, which is the agency that guards the Grand Canyon, right?
That's right. Absolutely right. Yes.
But you move your people in your various books all over the place. What makes you pick a particular landscape? Is it the story? Is it the characters? Or are you just interested in whatever the place is?
I think sometimes it can be all three, depending on the story itself. I've set stories at Fort Monroe in Virginia, which is a fascinating place. It's the first geographic location where slaves were brought to this country. And at the same time, in 1862, it became Freedom's Fortress, where slaves went there because it was the only place in Virginia that remained in Union hands during the Civil War. So the very same spot where people came and were enslaved then came for freedom. And to talk about lawyers, Benjamin Butler was the commanding general at Fort Monroe. And when all of a sudden they had thousands of slaves fleeing there for freedom, the Southerners came and said, under a flag of truce, they came and said, well, under the Fugitive Slave Act, you have to give those slaves back to us because it's a federal law. And Benjamin Butler, he was a terrible general, but he was a really good lawyer, said to them, well, so you're arguing under federal law. Yes, we are. Well, you seceded from the Union, therefore you are no longer under the protection of federal law. Goodbye. So they never get the slaves back. So it could be a location like that, like in this book, in the Atlee Pine book in Daylight. I sent her up to New Jersey and to start the novel off because Fort Dix is a big military installation there, and that's where she runs into, here we go. Here's the big disclosure: John Puller, who's a military CID agent for the Army, and he is running an investigation about a drug ring operating out of Fort Dix. And Atlee Pine wants to talk to the very same gentleman who's involved in the drug operation because he might be the grandson of the guy who kidnapped her twin sister Mercy all those years ago. I like moving. I think I like moving characters around because I love seeing new places. And when I go out and research an area, I don't have research assistants. I don't like to see things third hand. I don't like to get somebody else's perspective. I like to go and walk the place and look at the places and look at the people and look at the buildings and to study the history. And 9 times out of 10, something inspirational comes from that that I can actually use in the book. And I want to see things for myself. I want to talk to people directly. When I was a lawyer and I would go and interview all my witnesses, I wanted to do that face to face because 9 times out of 10, body language would tell me more sometimes than what they were telling me actually with words. So that was very important to me. And as a writer, I sort of adhere to that same discipline. I like to see it for myself.
Yeah, it's an interesting question you just threw up. Do you think that doing things in this virtual way on Zoom would allow you, if you were still practicing law, to pick up the same kinds of cues and so forth when talking to witnesses that you did when you were face to face with them?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. I think maybe, proximity, maybe the screen could give people, an opportunity to sort of deceive because they feel like there's a buffer zone there. But when you're in the same room with someone sitting 4 feet away from them across the table and talking to them, I don't know that there's not a buffer there. And when you're that intimate and that close to someone, it would be really hard to really keep up a deception for a long period of time. You and I, as former lawyers, we know that half the time people are going to lie to you, and the other half they're thinking about lying to you. So you just have to go with that flow and go in with some healthy skepticism about it, and so you can arrive at the truth. Because the last thing you want to do is, walk into court with a flawed theory based on false information. That's not good for anybody. So I like the face-to-face interviews, and I like going to the places themselves and just seeing it for myself. It adds a lot. Look, Wikipedia has never inspired me for for little things. Yes, if you want to find out about a certain specific thing that you don't have to go there and see it for yourself. A fact is a fact is a fact. That's fine. But for atmosphere and all the stuff, the nuances that go into making a story really fun to read, you just got to go out and see it for yourself.
I think you're right. And you remind me, when I was a baby editor, I applied to my friend John Sanford, who I think is a really brilliant writer. And and he said to me, and I've always remembered this, that you always want to bring in all five senses in a novel. And the most important one, but the one that's often most overlooked, is the sense of smell.
Yeah.
And if you're not there, if you don't go there, then the distinctive smell, even when interviewing a person, a nervous person can sweat in a particular way, so it isn't just the visual cues or the language, but you can pick up information from somebody by, you know, their the odor and all. And so the virtual does prevent you from doing that. Do you agree with John that it's important to bring the reader into the whole um landscape of the book by involving all the smells?
I think you have to do that to
Sorry,
the
all the senses.
Yes, I think you have to do that to the extent you can, because what we're trying to do is replicate in an authentic way on the pages things that people see every day. And people use all of their senses every day, whether they're aware of it or not. It just is. I mean, you talked about Grundy and the coal fields. You go to a place like that, and the coal is in the air. That every breath you take, there's something in the air that's toxic and not nauseous. You might get used to it over time, but if you're not from that area and you go there, it's demonstrably in the air, and you breathe it, you smell it, you feel it, it is there. So when you're trying to replicate that on the pages, you need to bring every tool and every weapon you can to bear to sort of bring the person smack dab in the middle of that area. So whether it be something they see, something they hear, something they smell, it's important. So any way you can get them to feel like they're actually there. Because I've heard from readers all over, and they say, "My God, you put me right in the moment. I feel like I'm right walking down the street next to your character because I feel like the way the details that you put in there, I feel like I'm actually there." And I know reading books that do that for me. I'm working my way through Ross McDonald's Lou Archer series right now. And the way he takes the time to set the scene to put me in there, I swear to God, I feel like I'm back in 1953. And it's an amazing feeling. And if you do it right, there's nothing like it.
I want to come back to your present predilection for 1940s noir, but let's talk, because after all, sort of the point here of daylight, let's talk a little bit about Atlee Pine. Now, if we go back to the first one, was that The Long Road to Mercy?
Yes, it was.
Okay, so basically, Atlee Pine, as a young girl, her sister Mercy was kidnapped, and I wanted to ask you, why did you choose that nursery rhyme to be a sort of signal that the kidnapper? Why that particular nursery rhyme becomes the signature of the kidnapper?
That nursery rhyme is kind of the ultimate. It can be seen as a very benign thing, but anytime you're talking about a choice, and I hearken back to before he passed away, had the honor and the opportunity to spend a good deal of time with William Styron, and he wrote the Ultimate Choice book in Sophie's Choice. So the Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, it's a kid's sort of tale. And I remember growing up as a kid, we would do the Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo's to pick teammates and all that. And if you were no good, you never got picked. But that's another story. So for me, it was a way to take sort of a childish kind of incantation and make it deadly serious and something really evil and twisted, which lent more, I think, more suspense and a sense of danger to this whole thing. But it also as you will learn, in the books going forward, it had impacts on everybody involved in the story. It's a nightmare that recurs for Atlee Pine all the time. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. And the thing about it is she really doesn't know the answer to it. Does that mean that she won or she lost? Was she picked or was she not picked? She was almost killed. So does that mean that she was the one who was chosen and to be almost killed, or was Mercy chosen to be taken? And it's almost not knowing any of that, not knowing what the point was, all of this has just haunted her all of this time. And putting on the fact that the only thing really she takes away from that night is that nursery rhyme, I think it makes it even more deadly for her.
It's hard. What were they, about six when this happened? I'm trying. Okay,
It was all,
so why would you have picked the Grand Canyon and an agency? I can understand why this might have impelled her to become an FBI agent, but why then did you decide to put her down in Arizona? I mean, I love it. I'm delighted. And the Grand Canyon, we had a wonderful trip to the Grand Canyon a couple of years ago and caught it in a blizzard. And I was thinking back to smell, because that there's a pine smell, there's a snow smell, there's all this wonderful different signature aromas around the canyon, which is so magnificent anyway. It basically stupefies everybody. But I don't know that people think about protection of the canyon. We think of it as a national park. We think about it as, rangers, and then there are, tribes that are around it and they have their own jurisdictions and all. But honestly, I never really thought about a dedicated FBI agency.
right. The reason I wrote about the Grand Canyon is that we went there several years ago, my wife and another couple who've been lifelong friends with, and we all raised our kids at the same time together. And we had a private tour person who took us there, and I'd never been. I'd been to Arizona, as you know, before. I'd been to see you, but I'd never been to the Grand Canyon. And for me, it was stunning, overwhelming, exhilarating, mysterious, everything that I would want to write about. And on the drive back, and our guide was tremendously knowledgeable about the area, and he was very opinionated about some of the tribes and the politics and all that. So we were staying in Sedona, so it was a long ride up and a long ride back. So I was in the front seat, and my wife and the other the couple were in the back seat, and the guy was talking, and I kept asking him questions about everything because I was fascinated. So for like 2.5 hours, he talked nonstop about the Grand Canyon. And finally, Michelle was like kicking the back of my seat because she was like, will you just shut up so he will shut up? Because I'm done. I'm just done with the Grand Canyon. And so when we flew back home, and I got back home, and I was like, this is such a fascinating place. I just felt that connection to it, just a visceral connection to it almost immediately. And I thought, there are places down there where no human being has ever set foot, that no other human being has even seen. So what a great place to set, my first novel, mystery. And it sort of dovetailed nicely because in my mind, Atlee Pine was going to be a loner. She didn't want to work with a pack of agents. She didn't want to be in a big building with lots of other agents and have this hierarchy. She was a person who wanted to be on her own, doing her job by herself as a loner. And that's what she wanted to be. She had her very faithful assistant in Carol Blum, but that was it. And as you well know, that area is it's very isolated, and you could go for a long way and not see another human being. But it's her bailiwick. It was her jurisdiction, and the Grand Canyon is a very it's a very prized part of this country, and it requires protection. And also, people don't realize too. I'm sure you do, being out there, but people go missing every year at the Grand Canyon. People die every year at the Grand Canyon from a variety of things. So there are investigations to be made, and it is federal land. And as you're right, there are a lot of tribes around, and they have their own police force and their own jurisdictions and laws. So for Atlee, it makes it very complicated for her to be a federal agent there, because she has to juggle lots of different things. There are a lot of sovereign nations out there that she has to deal with as well. And I think she liked that challenge too. She likes to sort of build a consensus. So for all those reasons, I came back from that trip and I was like, Atlee Pine is going to Arizona.
I love it. Do you know, since you were in Sedona, one of the things I always think is so much fun is that when you're in Sedona, you're in the bottom of all that gorgeous rock and you're looking up. Well, except when you're on the overhang, but when you're driving through the canyon, Oak Creek Canyon. And so it's a miniature view of the Grand Canyon, but it's also a bottom up view. Whereas the Grand Canyon, unless you hit on the mule or decide to hike all the way down to the bottom, most people see the Grand Canyon from top down.
That's right.
My
Absolutely.
brother, when the year I turned 50, my brother, who had a private pilot's license, his birthday present to me was to take his little airplane and fly me over the Grand Canyon from one end to the other, before that became outlawed or whatever it was, and fairly low. But it's too big to really take in. Even from that, maybe drones today can do a better job showing us the canyon, because airplanes fly so high that regular commercial flights you can't really see it. But I do think that people should always go to Sedona as part of it and then get that other experience.
Yeah, you're right about that. You really get a feel for two different areas, topographically, but they're also sort of similar. The first time I ever saw the Grand Canyon was actually from a commercial airline flight. We were flying out. I was flying out to LA, and the pilot came on and said, and I quote him, because I am the best pilot on earth. He said, I have gotten you out to the West Coast 1.5 hours early. Obviously, we had a massive tailwind somehow. He goes, the problem is LAX is not ready to receive us. We don't have a gate. So I've gotten permission to drop down to 5,000 feet, and I'm going to take you on a tour of the Grand Canyon. So he
Wow.
down to 5,000 feet, and we went around the entire expanse of the Grand Canyon, and the first time I'd ever seen it. And people were like, we were shuffling over to one side, his bank this way, we were shuffling over to this way as we were banking the other way. And he knew it intimately and gave us a really detailed description of all the things down there, which was amazing. And he said, okay, we're heading to LA. And we went back up to 35,000 feet and we flew on. And that was my first taste of it. But I got to tell you, you seeing it from the ground, and how you can't see all of it from any one point. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Was absolutely, I was just gobsmacked.
Well, I can certainly understand that. And your earlier comments about social media and so forth, more people are dying than ever at the Grand Canyon in search of a photograph. They keep stepping over the rim, people taking selfies, or they climb stupidly up on rocks and all. It's just astonishing what people will risk for a moment of fame on Instagram.
I know it's, well, the Grand Canyon is a beautiful place. It's also an unforgiving place, and it can be very dangerous if you don't follow the rules. And there's a lot of places. There's a lot of ways you can hurt yourself out there if you're really stupid about it.
That's very true. Thelma and Louise didn't help us either. Just another. Well, anyway, so we have Atlee Pine. She went on in A Minute to Midnight, but now when we're talking about daylight, she is still searching for what happened to her sister. And she has, I think, a very compassionate supervisor who, understands that while she really shouldn't go off the reservation on a private quest as a federal agent, at least not on federal time, he's pretty lenient about it. And so she goes off, as you say, to New Jersey. Now, what impels her to go to New Jersey?
So she finds out that she's tracked down a guy named Ito Vincenzo, who she thinks might have kidnapped her sister all those years ago. And the only living relative that she's been able to track down is Vincenzo's grandson. who works in the motor pool at Fort Dix in New Jersey. And she wants to talk to this guy. She has no idea that he might be a criminal. She just wants to talk to him to see if he has any line on his grandfather. Is he still alive? Can she get an address? Can she go talk to this guy and sort of try to get the truth out of him? And that's when she runs literally and figuratively in the first chapter into John Puller, who is staking out Vincenzo's house because he wants to arrest the guy because he thinks he's operating a drug operation out of Fort Dix. And when they run into each other, they decide, well, let's partner on this. You can help me in my case, and I can help you on your search for your sister. And that's how they move forward. I really like bringing Puller back. I call it Easter egg. I'd said a little foreshadowing of it a minute to midnight, where she mentioned she knew John Puller and he had helped her on an investigation, a joint investigation, and he had been a really good mentor. And I'd been wanting to bring Puller back for a long time. And I thought, if she's going to go to Fort Dix and have to deal with the military anyway, it'd be a prime opportunity for Puller to come in and help her. And I think they make a really good team here. And it gives readers two bangs for the buck. They get to see a series character they haven't seen in a while. I get so many emails. When is Puller coming back? When is Puller coming back? And he's back. He's back. And you'll get to see him in all his glory.
I liked him a lot. It was fun. Before I want to talk about Puller, though, I had a very nice email from someone I will not quote by name, who had volunteered to me how much she likes Atlee Pine. And so I thought it was such a nice paragraph, I would like to read it. I love the fact that Atlee has the hallmarks of a classic protagonist, FBI agent, tragic past, relentless thirst for knowledge, while also being fresh and original. Her physical size, her passion for serious weightlifting, her ability to run the Grand Canyon, she really can beat up a gang of bikers, and she moves and presents with that confidence. She's unapologetically herself, and that makes for a fun and refreshing read. Now that's really a signal that you have connected with readers very specially, and especially with female readers. So all this bullshit about, guys can't write women and women can't write guys and all, I thought was perfectly encapsulated in this email where, you have a rave from a woman who's an author and a fan.
I love it. I really thank her for making that comment. And what I try to do is, even though obviously I'm not female, but writers have to be observers. And I grew up surrounded by strong female role models, both my grandmothers, my mom, who's a force of nature, my sister, who had a career as a journalist. I'm married to a strong, independent woman. We raised one of our daughter as a very strong, independent woman. And I've had those experiences and observations in my whole life. So sitting down to create a character, what I wanted to do with Atlee Pine was I didn't want to make her, a caricature of what you think a federal agent should be as a female. I know a lot of women in federal law enforcement. In fact, one of my King and Maxwell books, I actually mentioned WIFL. WIFL is an acronym that stands for Women in Federal Law Enforcement, and they have their own sort of organization. And the head of it called me up and said, "Hey, you're the only author I know who's ever mentioned us in the book. You want to come and talk to us, at our national convention in DC?" So I went. It was me. I was the only guy with 800 women in this huge ballroom. All of them had guns. I've never been more intimidated in my whole life by this, but I have, I talked to a lot of them and over the years, and I understand that it's a very male dominated world, even in 2020. And for a woman to get ahead in that arena, they have to work 3 times as hard to get to the same level. So I understand the ambition and the drive and the desire that has to go into that to tackle a very male dominated arena. And I wanted to have a character in Atlee who was not going to make any apologies, no exceptions, no excuses. She wasn't going to go in timid. She wasn't going to go in and try to play by the rules. She was going to go in and be herself. And if anybody had a problem with that, that's their problem, not her problem. And that was the attitude that I brought to bear. I'm not saying she's not vulnerable. I'm not saying she doesn't make mistakes. She does. I'm not saying that sometimes she goes down the wrong path when she shouldn't, but that's all about being human. That's not about being a man or a woman. That's just what makes us human. But yeah, she is kind of kick-ass because she, I feel like she says, I worked my butt off to get where I am. If you have a problem with that, get out of my way. Because I'm not going to tell you, oh, I feel so sorry that I might have taken some guy's job, or I'm so sorry that, maybe you don't think I should be here. Get out of my way. I'm here. Deal with it.
Well, she does have to have a certain degree of physical toughness and fitness to survive. It can't all be just, personality and motivation. You have to be particularly fit. And I do think that most successful female protagonists do have that element. They either have a martial arts skill, or they're runners, or they have something that, because you have to think about keeping them safe. I mean, if they're going to go up against bad guys, it can't all be just, mental.
No, it can't be all cerebral, and she takes it very seriously. So all the attributes I gave her, it wasn't just gratuitous. I didn't make her, an Olympic caliber weightlifter just for the fun of it. I didn't make her want to, learn martial arts for the fun of it. She did it with a very, obvious goal in mind. These attributes were going to help her in her career choice, and it's what she wanted to do and what she wanted to be. So if you go into a situation like that and you are physically fit and physically strong, your odds of survival are much better. Yeah, you have to have the cerebral part of it too. You have to outthink people are opposing you, but at the same time, if you can't cut it physically, not only will you not get the respect of the people you're dealing with, because in that world too, it's kind of a macho world. A lot of the guys work out, they got a lot of muscle, and they're looking at you thinking, can you carry your weight? And when they find out you can, then all of a sudden you've cleared that hurdle, and your life gets a little bit easier.
So we've talked about Atlee and her attributes. Let's talk a little bit about Puller. Do military investigators, do you know, get training from anyone besides military officers?
Yeah, it's interesting with the Army CID. It's all non-commissioned officers. So you're not going to go from West Point to being a CID agent. They want it coming like from the working blue collar class of the military for a lot of different reasons. So when Puller, he joined the ranks and he was enlisted and he was in combat and he came up and went from combat to Army CID. He's still in the military. He still wears a uniform, but he's an investigator. And so all of his training really came from the military, and whether it be combat or some of the investigative training. CID is its whole organization. They have thousands of agents. They have a worldwide footprint. They do a lot of joint operations. You can imagine with other civilian organizations, whether it be FBI or other outposts. Every branch of the military has its own version of CID, whether it's Air Force or Navy. Like NCIS would be the counterpart to this Army CID. They can do training at FLETC down in Georgia, which is the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. And they have to have regular, retraining and with weaponry and tactics and investigative techniques. Most of them, they're trained at Fort Leonard Wood in the Midwest, which is where a lot of Army CIDs get most of their training from. But it's a continuous education as they go forward, and a lot of them will stay in those careers for a long time. And you can also be a civilian and become an Army CID agent as well. You don't have to technically be in the military to be an Army CID agent.
So that being true, in what ways is a military investigation different than a local, a state, or a federal investigation?
Well, the biggest part is the laws that apply to military personnel, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It's a more stringent code, and you have fewer rights as a member of the United States military. Some of the constitutional rights that apply to citizens don't apply to military personnel. For instance, there's no bail in the military system. So if you're arrested for a crime, you can't post bail and get out. If they require you to stay in, there's no option for you to post bail. And it's just there's a higher standard of both morality and duty and law that's attributable to members of the military. And when you have court martials, you're held to a higher standard than you might be. It may not just be, beyond a reasonable doubt. It's something a little bit higher than that, a little bit tougher hurdle for people because their conduct is gauged at a higher level. Which I think it probably is a good thing. The military has its own rules and conduct because they live in a different world where chain of command is paramount. And they can't have, soldiers saying, well, I'm just going to go off on my own and do what I want to do, then everything just breaks down. So that really is the big difference. And in this book, you sort of see some of the differences between Puller and Pine. Puller says something, he gives us an order and he expects Pine to just follow the order. And she has to point out to him a couple of times that, guess what, John, I'm not in the military, so you can't order me around. And sometimes how they go about their investigation is a little bit different. He's used to sort of barging ahead because he knows he can do what he can do. And she's from a different beast. She's with the federal government, and all the constitutional rules and laws apply to her where it doesn't really apply to Puller sometimes.
Well, yeah, this is the reason I was bringing this up because, they are in some respects an unlikely pair operating together. And, both the military and the FBI are federally funded. branches of the government. So would you expect to find conflicts when they investigate or they run into each other, or would you expect cooperation?
I would definitely expect cooperation, but you have to understand that the military and civilian components are two very different worlds. There are few organizations that are more complicated and bureaucratic than the Federal Bureau of Investigation. One of them is the United States Army. There is no organization on earth that I've ever encountered that is more complicated than the United States Army. And people, even in the Army, will tell you that the rules and regulations, the layers of command, the bureaucracy, the hierarchy is unparalleled. It's just the way it is. And the Army is a beast when it comes to that stuff. And I remember writing the first Polar book, and I needed to understand, how the military laws worked and how regulations worked and all the different, the medals and the way you're supposed to place your ribbons in a particular order. And you cannot make a mistake on that when you're displaying them. It's like your wall of honor on your, and it was like volume after volume after volume that I have to read and pour through. I mean, a lot of it was interesting. A lot of it was drudge. I felt like I was almost back in law school, reading like the uniform code of uniform commercial code, where you have like hundreds of regulations and just these arcane details. That's the Army life. That's just the Army way.
So I talked to not an Army, but a Marine colonel, and he did agree that despite, the uniform and the code of conduct and all this other stuff, there was notably a small percentage of military personnel who get into significant trouble, hence Puller. And but a bigger question would be, can you really posit a senior military officer getting into trouble, or is it more likely? I mean, never mind the generals and the sex scandals. I mean, that's a whole different thing. But would you expect senior level people to be like engaged in drug running or, some of the stuff, or is that mostly going to be at a lower pay grade and lower rank?
Yeah, I think that some of the bigger problems they have there are just violence against people, domestic abuse, drug use, drug dealing. A lot of it happens in the enlisted ranks. I'm not saying the officers are never involved in that. Certainly they are. I think where the higher ranking senior officers run afoul is just doing things they shouldn't do, being bribed, for instance, to look the
Right.
other way. They had that big case a number of years ago about that businessman from Malaysia that got so many different admirals embroiled in that. It's like wiped out the entire Seventh Fleet of leadership because everyone was going to being court-martialed. And they just, they get in these positions of power, but then they are sort of matriculating to, be with people who are very highly placed and very wealthy in the civilian field. And there's business ties. When you think about a naval port, okay, it's a naval port, but think about the business that would come from that. You have to have fuel, you have to have supplies, you have to have food for the people on there. There's lots of commerce that can be there, lots of money running back and forth, and that could be very tempting to people, unfortunately, and who have in a position to make decisions where that money goes. So they can be bribed. And I think so in the senior ranks, the people who have this decision-making capability, bribery probably is the worst one when they run afoul of that and they get into, positions, because you could be a four-star general and yeah, your income is good. It's not like you're making $1 million a year. You're not, and your expenses could be pretty heavy because you're traveling around, your family keeps moving around and all that. So it's not like you're wealthy at all. So sometimes that temptation of wealth and people who have a lot of dollars, gets the best of them.
Well, you're right. There are a lot of logistics involved. And if you go back and look at D-Day, I mean, Eisenhower, one of his geniuses was that he was really good at logistics, the whole supply side of it. I mean, that's a different thing than strategy. You have to have, I mean, I've done a lot of cruising, and I have to tell you that stocking a big ship for a long cruise is, akin to a military campaign. You really got to think seriously about the entire supply chain, and you have to have a chain of command in order to make it all work and so forth. So yeah, I guess my point was that I think the kind of thing that Puller's looking at in this book in New Jersey is more likely to be um, not the high ranking guys, but
Right.
lower down where people get into the ordinary kinds of trouble with drugs and other stuff. Are there any topics that Puller might investigate that you would be reluctant to write about, either because they're scary or some other reason?
In the first book, I took sort of a nuclear device, and I remember researching that where I read I know, thousands of pages about the different types of nuclear weapons, how they're built, how they're put together. And you look at movies when there's like a nuclear device and they're trying to disarm it. The truth of that is that once a nuclear device has been engaged, there's no way to disarm it or turn it off. The only thing you can do is turn a nuclear device into a conventional warhead. So there's not the radiation fallout in the mushroom cloud. And I remember, so if I can take on nuclear weapons, which obviously is the sort of the ultimate domestic terror, I think I can probably take on a lot of other things with Pillar. I don't think anything's really out of bound. I mean, there's corruption everywhere. I could definitely see Puller, investigating cases that have to do with military and also public official corruption. I don't think that's out of bounds at all because that certainly happens. But I remember working on that nuclear device case, and the way you can sort of disarm a nuclear device is you don't have this huge explosion, you just have a small one. So instead of millions of people die, maybe you have a few hundred who die, and that's the best you can do. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, this is going to be a tricky balance because I've got all these facts and research in my head, thousands of pages. I need to distill this down to a page and a half of information, and even then it could get a little tricky. So the device I came up with is John Puller's in this bunker trying to do what he can to stop this thing from a mushroom clouding. And he's talking with his brother, Bobby, who is an expert, one of the world's experts on nuclear devices. And Bobby is telling his brother, who is a layman when it comes to that stuff, why he's doing what he has to do and what the result will be in layman's terms. But what Bobby Puller is really doing is explaining to the reader in layman's terms what is happening. So they're sort of perched on John Puller's shoulder. That was sometimes when you have really technical stuff, you have to think as a writer, how can I get this out in a way that's not going to stop the story cold? Because it could easily stop the story cold. I call them flip pages. As much as I enjoyed Tom Clancy, Tom kept a lot of his research in. He just loved that stuff, you could tell. But at the end of the day, when you get to it, and then you run into this wall of technical stuff, you just flip past the stuff until you get to the end of, how many tons the aircraft carrier is, and how many guns it has, how many planes it has, and all that to get back to the story. So I never want to have a flip book. And my way of doing it is all this research that I do is really important. I immerse myself in it in a way that I can explain it in layman's terms to people and distill it down to just a few sentences here and there. And it's great stuff, and people really love learning that, but it doesn't interrupt the flow of the story.
I can see that cybercrimes may be an interesting challenge because it's bound to creep over to the military, bitcoins and all kinds of stuff, credit card frauds and all, but there we are. But getting back to Atlee, just to round this up before we take questions, we don't have any spoilers, but is her quest, how long are you going to have her on a quest for her sister? Is it going to be throughout however many novels it is, or is she one day going to find out what happened?
Well, at the end of this novel, she finds out a great deal, both about what happened to her sister and also about her own past. A past that she thought was true and factual. Turns out her entire past was pretty much fabricated, and nothing that she grew up believing actually turned out to be true. So I'm working on the fourth novel now, and it won't be the final Atlee Pine book, but in this fourth novel, you will find out everything that happened to Mercy Pine, and there will be complete closure on that. And I thought 4 books justified it. I titled the first book Long Road to Mercy, and I meant it. It was not going to be a short journey to figure out the truth behind all of this. But the fourth book will wind everything up vis-a-vis Mercy Pine.
But the fourth book won't be the next book you're publishing, will it?
No, the next book you'll see from me it'll be in the spring. It's called A Gambling Man, and it's a sequel to One Good Deed, which brings back Aloysius Archer, my gumshoe detective in 1949. So,
right. Well, if we have time, we'll talk about that. But let me find out if we have questions, because I can't squelch all the fans.
Okay.
Andrew?
Yeah, there are some questions here. Actually, there are several questions, David, about the Camel Club. And is there ever going to be another Camel Club novel?
I've never been at an event where I didn't get a question about the Camel Club. I brought them back a number of years ago in an ebook only called Bullseye, where I paired them with Will Roby. I've thought often about bringing the Camel Club back. I just haven't really figured out a good plot to put them into. I could definitely see them being a crossover where I bring maybe all of them or some of them back, where I have Oliver Stone and maybe working with one of my other series characters. I really enjoy that method. I always enjoyed series where they cross the streams, NCIS LA meets NCIS New Orleans or whatever, and you get to see all your good characters in the same series. So I definitely could see myself bringing the Camel Club back in a crossover.
Similar question about your young adult novels. Anything in the works there?
Yeah, so my British publisher, we've redone the four Vega Jane novels. We've retitled them. I've edited them down to a better length for young readers, new illustrations and all that. And the first one of that is it's going to be Vega Jane and the Secrets of Sorcery that's relaunching in England and starting in January. And then every 6 months, another book will be coming out. So I've been working on that too. I think that they really think it has a lot of potential. I mean, it sold very well. It was a #1 bestseller, but they really think, and the Brits are very keen on relaunching this to a specific audience, and they think can do very well. So I enjoyed the heck out of writing those novels. I mean, I love mythology growing up. I love fantasy novels growing up. And to be able to create one of my own over 4 books was just delightful. And it tested my mettle as a writer. I had to exercise different writer muscles in putting that together. The most important was that you never write down to kids, never ever write down to kids. Kids are smart and bright, and boy, you make a mistake anywhere and they'll be all over you, so you got to bring your A game.
I have a question myself, actually, involves character names. I think you have some of the best character names in the business. And Atlee Pine sounds like a character out of a Faulkner novel. Well, you've got Decker and Puller, and you obviously put a lot of thought into your character names. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I definitely do. So with Atlee Pine, I wanted her to have a really unusual first name. And Atlee, I know Atlee. Atlee is a Southern name, and it could be a girl or a boy's name. I've known Atlee most of my life. When I was growing up in Richmond, I played football and wrestling, and we would play against Atlee High School every year. And when I would go down to visit my parents off of 95, there's an exit off of 95. If you go one way, you go to my parents' house. You go the other way, you go to Atlee, Virginia. So Atlee has just been a big part of my life. And I wanted her last name to be, monosyllabic. I wanted it to be just, that's it, Pine. It's like strong and firm, and it's a pine tree. So Atlee Pine just sort of came together for me. Some of the other names like Aloysius Archer. I've always loved the name Aloysius. You almost never hear it anymore. Nobody names your kid Aloysius anymore. But Archer is kind of a tip of the hat to Ross McDonald's Lou Archer character. And I've always just liked that last name. It just, feels right. It's kind of feels like a name that would be solid as a rock in the 1940s, 1950s. And so I like that. John Puller, I grew up in Virginia, and every school kid in Virginia learned about Chesty Puller. Chesty Puller was the most decorated Marine in U.S. history. And he was from Staunton, Virginia. And so I sort of patterned John Puller's father after Chesty Puller. And he was a 3-star. He never got the 4-star because he didn't play politics. This guy, he was in his 60s. He volunteered for active duty in Vietnam, in his 60s. He won every award, every medal you could possibly win for the most part. His son was also a decorated veteran as well. So Puller, that's where the Puller name came from. But names are important, particularly if you're writing a series like Amos Decker. Nobody names their kid Amos anymore. I just matriculated to Amos for whatever reason. It was just a different name, and he was a different character. I wanted him to stand out. I didn't want to name him Bill or Bob or Sam. Amos just fit him. I don't know where the name really came from. It's maybe in my head for a long time. But as soon as I sat down to write that character, his name was Amos Decker, and I never deviated from that from day one.
This is a really interesting question. Someone named Pat is asking, how much vulnerability do you think a protagonist needs?
That is a really good question. And I think they need copious amounts of it at times, because nobody wants to read about, a perfect character who never makes a mistake. And Atlee Pine, as physically strong as she is, John Puller, as physically fit as he is, they both are fragile at times. And a lot of it has to do with their upbringing, their background. Both of them have fractured familiar relationships. Atlee Pine lost her entire family. John Puller has always felt like he's never able to live up to his old man ever in his life. And that whatever he would do was never going to be good enough, because his old man would always outrank him, and he would always out-military him. He would be more Army than his son could possibly ever be, even though John Puller was a combat veteran and was wounded serving his country. So there's fragility, though, for me, and vulnerability equates in a certain way to strength. Because at the end of the day, we have those things. We all have them. We learn to live with them. We learn to overcome them. Sometimes we fall down with them. But the strength is that we pick ourselves back up and keep going. I would never want to write about a perfect character because I would never want to read about a perfect character. How nauseating would that possibly be? I think that what makes us interesting as human beings is that we fail a lot. We make mistakes a lot in life. But the fact that the character building part of it is, do we learn from them or do we keep repeating those same mistakes over and over again? At the end of the day, at the end of your life, that sort of proves who you are as a person.
Excellent answer.
Yeah. Okay. There was a question, I lost track of it precisely, but it involves when you were writing your first book, how difficult was it to balance that in your law practice?
It was incredibly difficult to balance that in the law practice. I mean, the firm I was working with, they had no idea I was even writing fiction. And they certainly weren't paying me to write fiction. They were paying me to bill out, hour increments of my life for their financial sustainability. So I had to pick my moments. And my time to write was 10 o'clock at night till 2 o'clock in the morning, and pretty much 7 nights a week. And I did that for years and years and years. And I know that sounds draconian, but for me, it was just wonderful time, because that was a time where I could write what I wanted to write, not some client was paying me or what some partner was telling me that I had to write, not a brief I had to deliver for a case or a deal I had to put together. I was writing the stuff that I wanted to write. So it was incredibly exhilarating to run down those steps to my little cubbyhole at 10 o'clock at night and write away until, the wee hours of the morning. And I think that most writers you talk to will tell you a similar story. It's not like you can just say, oh yeah, I got a job, but I'm just going to, chuck that. I'm going to just write during the day and starve. I had a family. I was married. I had one child back then. The starving writer route I couldn't do. But most writers, they had full-time jobs and they love writing, and they just did it whenever they could. They found their niche, they found their time, they found their slot, and they just did it. And if you want to have a career as a writer, that's what you're going to have to do. There's no guarantee that even that will make you have a career, but that is an essential first step. I've tried to be, I tell people, try to be as creative in finding time to write as you are in writing your stories. And it can be done. You can be creative in all walks of life. But one of the things you have to be creative about is finding that time to write.
Okay, I have a question about your audiobooks. And do you have input into selecting the readers?
The audiobooks are super popular now because people download them to their phones and their electronic devices, and it's been great for publishers. And I have input in all of those things, and I pick the teams. They send me audition tapes, and I listen to them. For the Vega Jane series, I remember we had a reader who was on the phone, and was like 10 of us on the phone, and we were listening to her, and I would say, okay, do a Cockney accent. And she'd do a Cockney accent on demand. Could do a Scottish accent. She'd do a Scottish accent, do a Welsh accent. It was amazing. I was just so impressed with her talent. Actually, she was the one selected to read the first Vega Jane book. But the readers are really important. Years ago, when I would only have one reader doing all the parts, and finally, as talented as the reader was, I finally said, you know what? Let's just get a team then, because we can have two readers, and we can have one reader. I don't want to have the male reader, who's incredibly talented, having to do this fake falsetto every time a female's part comes in. It just it's disrespectful to everybody and everything. So now the books are read by two readers, male and female, and depending on who the narrator is, depends on, like Atlee Pine, the narrator is a female because it's a female driven protagonist. And I love listening to the audiobooks. I swear to God, I have sat in my garage with the car running, listening to the ends of some of my books, even though I know how they're going to end. But it's just a totally different performance. I'm like, God, that was really good. I know I wrote the words, but they breathe life into them in a way that I can't do on the written page. They are not reading, they are performing what I've written. And it's just sort of an exhilarating experience.
Question about mentors. And maybe teachers when you were coming up. A lot of writers kind of point to teachers or other figures who are very instrumental in moving them along on their path. How about you?
I had a number of them at all levels. I remember my fourth grade school teacher who taught me English was, and I'm not making this up, her name was Mrs. English. Jewel English was my fourth grade English teacher. And she was quite the force in my life. She was the one where I first started writing little short stories and would give them to her to read, and she would give me feedback on that. I had people in high school that I would write a lot and let them read it, teachers read it and give me critical feedback. The same happened to me in college. Bob Holsworth at Virginia Commonwealth University, I probably took more classes from him than anybody else. He's a political consultant. He's one of the, like a Larry Sabato guy. He's like, the poll predictors and all that stuff, and just a genius in his field. And all I did in his class was write. I read great books and I would write and think about what I was reading and sort of express myself in writing. And he gave me a great deal of great feedback. And teachers are important. Look, writing is a tough business because you are giving something that you created something that didn't exist before you thought of it. Put it down on paper, and then you give it to maybe a complete stranger to read, and maybe they tear it apart and they don't like it. So you really are putting yourself out on a limb there. But I got to tell you that getting constructive feedback, not just criticism that has no point other than to make you feel bad, but constructive criticism to say, I like this part, but I had an issue with this part. And that's what some of the best editorial relationships are. I've had the same editor for probably 20 books now. In fact, he left the publisher to move to an agency. Luckily, it was my agent, so he joined that agency. But I was like, at this point in my career, I am not going to start over. So the publisher still engages him to edit my books, even though he's an agent now. And that relationship is one built on trust, and it evolves over time. So I know that when I get a comment from him or there's an editorial letter where he has this issue or that issue, I know he's doing it with the best intentions, and our goals are completely aligned. And the goal is to make the book as good as it possibly can be. I tell aspiring writers, no word you write is set in stone. It can be made better. You may not always agree with the comments of your editor, but you have to respect their opinions and listen to them and give it a full, faithful, hearing out. Because at the end of the day, the goal is the same, to make a good book even better.
I was really sad when Mitch left to go to be an agent, because I think I agree with you. I think he was a tremendous editor. I've never asked him why he changed career paths, and I obviously am not going to do it here, but it still made me sad. Is there anything else, Patrick? All right, well, I have a couple things. I wanted to offer a comment because somebody sent this to me, and I think it's hilarious, David. You may have spoken about this before, but when you were first published in Italy, as I understand it, the publisher insisted that you change your name.
Yes.
And the reason is that Baldacci did not sound like an American novelist, so they wanted you. What did you end up being called for your Italian publisher?
Yeah, so they Mondadori was my publisher back then, and I thought they had a problem with the title. When they said they had a problem with the name, I thought they meant the title of the book, Absolute Power. And I thought, well, that should translate well into Italian, Absolute Power. And then they said, no, the problem is with your name. And I was dumbfounded. And they said, well, the issue is that Italians don't read books written by other Italians. And which kind of blew me away, because I thought, Dante, Machiavelli, and Puzo had pretty good careers, didn't they? And they said, well, much like movies, people want to read American thriller writers. They don't want to read just another Italian guy who they think might be a second or third tier. So here's how that name came about. So I got mad, and my agent knew I was mad, and he said, look, let's talk about it tomorrow. And I said, no, you've got Mondadori in your office right now, the head of Mondadori. You give me 5 seconds, I'll come up with the greatest American name you've ever heard. And he said, okay. So I put the phone down, and I thought, oh Christ, what do I do now? So I looked out the window, and we owned an Explorer. So I saw the big blue emblem, and I said, I'm going to be called David Ford. So I was a #1 bestseller, David Ford, Absolute Power, in Italy. And my second novel, I was David, middle initial B Ford. My third novel, was David Baldacci Ford. They had to make the book wider to accommodate all my names. And now I'm just David Baldacci, because I know I'm actually an American and not an Italian. The craziest thing, if I had written that in the book, people would have been like, oh, what are you, crazy? Are you on drugs? What are you talking about? Never gonna happen. Yes, it did happen. Go check it out.
I love it. So you've touched it. We've unfortunately run out of time to go into this, but I really wanted to talk to you about your current predilection for American noir, and Aloysius Archer being, a guy in this period of the great 1930s, 40s, and early 50s. And, David, since I was born in 1940, I actually read those people when they wrote. I missed the 30s. That was my mother. But I started reading so young that I read Ross MacDonald in real time, and, caught so many. And maybe we could at some point, because Patrick has not only got a passion for that, but incredibly knowledgeable about the whole thing. maybe what we should do is have a little conversation again and talk about that. Do you know, we did a really wonderful event with Brad Thor. He was so frustrated, and so was I, that we couldn't talk about the end of his book when we launched it in July, that we had a Brad Thor book club in October. And the deal was that there were going to be no spoilers. So you had to have read the books. And we got to talk about that book all the way through. But then fans from all over the world send in questions they've always wanted to ask. We got them from New Zealand. We got them from Bulgaria. It was great. So if you have some extra time, maybe we could set up, it's a webinar. It's different. You have to, because you use the chat feature and everything. But it would really be fun to talk about that. Let me talk to Kristen and see if there's some half hour or hour in your schedule, or we could do that.
That sounds great. I'd love that.
It really was. It was fabulous. I think it was one of the most successful things we've done. We got so many thank you letters from fans. But what I loved about it was the international nature of it.
Right.
It was great.
Books and storytelling, they crosses all borders. And one good thing about these sort of the virtual stuff that we're doing right now is that you're not confined to one room, in one place. You can really reach across the entire planet, which I think even going forward, once we get past COVID, I think this is not going away, because this is the way for people to really reach out broadly. And there's nothing wrong with that. Let's spread the word. Books and reading and all that, great. Keep doing it. Do it even more.
I totally agree with you. And we have done so many events with authors all over the world. I have memorized time zones in Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, Iceland. Wonderful author in Iceland. And Patrick and I have both laughed about the fact that the hardest thing for people during all this is to figure out what time zone they're in relation to anything else. I'm not kidding. Is there anything you would like to say to your fans before we wrap this up about Daylight?
Yeah, I mean, I hope they enjoy the latest installment. The Daylight is an apt title because there's a lot of daylight for her in this novel. And I knew after two, they've been waiting patiently. They wanted, know more information about what happens to Mercy and also about Atlee Pine's past. And Daylight really delivers a lot of that. They're stunning. My wife read the book in about a day and a half, and she's very critical, and I count on her to tell me what's wrong with the novel, and she's very open to doing that.
That's why you're happily married, right? Constructive criticism. I can't believe that I forgot to make the commercial at the very beginning of this. We have autographed copies, not tip-ins, not book plates, but real books signed by David. Not a huge number of them left of Daylight. So any of you who are watching this, now is your time to snag one. Also, this will become a podcast, and you can also watch it on YouTube. So if you have friends who are Baldacci fans, or people you think you ought to be Baldacci fans, you can snag them in with podcasts, or they can look on YouTube. David, it's just a great pleasure to talk to you. We always have so much fun. I wish we could do this for 2 hours, but I think that that's too great for most people's attention span, not only your own. So thank you for spending this time with us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your tour.
Thank you, Barbara, very much. I always love spending time with you. Take care, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. All right. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And as I said, don't forget, we have autographed copies of Daylight. Bye.